Hi everyone, my name is Erik Adler. I'm a teacher and a fantasy writer, and today I'd like to read you the next part of my first fantasy novel to you, which I am translating currently into English from German. The novel is called White Lights, and this is a second intermediate chapter. The last time I read the first chapter to you, The Island of the Blessed, where Richard, who is our hero, came to a mysterious island. He was sent there by an even more mysterious elderly Chinese man, and he met a few very beautiful young women there, and then there was a battle and he had to escape from this island. He escaped together with one of these women whom he had got to know there, and then she disappeared on a smaller island which they came later, and now he wakes up and the story continues. This one is called The Silent House. Shadows flickered before his inner eye. An old Asian laughing. Pretty girls in the colors of the rainbow smiling. A young Asian woman in deep sorrow. And a blonde screaming with fear. And then there were the others. Red eyes in enormous bald heads. Faces full of wrinkles, distorted with rage, human and yet non-human. He turned on his back and stared into the darkness. He knew this island. Samothrace? They had spent the last real holiday in Greece. After visiting Alexandropoli, they had gone out to the sea. Layla splashed happily in the water and collected white stones, which she piled up on the beach. Richard leafed through his guidebook. Paula swam for a while, but found it too cold. It was September, and after all, Thrace was not Crete. The island lay before them. Samothrace had once been the center of a mystery cult dedicated to the chthonic gods, gods of life and fertility, he read. The one in his dream had looked like Samothrace, but it could not be the same island, for it had been much too small and too close to the coast. Although having served as a soldier, he had never had to experience war. Now, for the first time, if only in his dream, he had been in a battle, and he had failed. He had acted too late, and the women were dead. During his years staying at home, he had forgotten what it meant to be a soldier. For many of the cadets at the military academy, it had been a vocation. The incredible importance of the surface, extreme cleanliness, strict posture, eye contact, firm voice, exaggerated courtesy. The role was like the uniform in which one dressed each morning. It had provided him with an identity. His 3 years of service in Eckernförde at the Baltic Sea, the old town with the fishermen's houses, the long walks by the sea, smoked fish shining like gold, the delicious anise schnapps, the regattas, the harbour festivals, Layla's enthusiasm for the old candy factory, his daily work in the Torpedo Research Center. At a party, the captain had walked around the table, drinking a vodka with each of the officers and sub-officers present. Too many more years in service, Richard had said, just to say something. 2 months later he had resigned. He would have liked to stay in Eckernförde. He felt at home living in a small town. Paula wanted to get away. She would have preferred to live in Tokyo or in New York City. It suited her temperament better. He had returned to Munich in a feeling of melancholy, moving from one corner of Germany to another to start a new life in the household, like a turn of 180 degrees. His colleagues in the Navy had smiled at him, exchanging the uniform for an apron, they had called it. Many had seemed embarrassed on his behalf. They had been trying to talk it out of him, telling him he would fall into a hole. The only real contempt he had to face came from a few female soldiers, who ignored him after his resignation became public. Those who weren't attracted to women almost always had boyfriends or husbands serving in the Navy, always with a higher rank. Later, he experienced a similar aversion from the manager's wives, many of whom were housewives. He read it in their eyes. To them, he was no real man. He did not participate in the NATO operation in the Mediterranean, for which they had been preparing for so long. At the time, he felt relieved when the news came that another submarine had been chosen. In retrospect, he was not so sure. Taking part in an international sea surveillance with the aim of protecting ship traffic against terrorist attacks would have been an experience for life. It all felt somewhat incomplete. They had been practicing and practicing for a mission that never came. When in his dream the time for action came, his fear had paralyzed him. For many cadets, the lecture on ancient Stoicism at the academy was like coming home. Ethics as an athletic training program, with the aim of mental purification, freeing yourself from everything that kept you down. Anger, fear, grief, greed. Remaining calm, committed, loyal, willing to take risks, even under extreme pressure. He had imagined it would be enough just adapting to the circumstances. He already had the necessary self-discipline. Bodybuilding meant living Stoicism physically, making a fortress out of your body by constant self-overcoming. And physical discipline was the basis for all kinds of discipline, the Stoics had taught. The emotional control expected of the cadets came easily to him. He went through all the exercises and tests for submarine service like fire and flooding without showing any sign of fear, never becoming impatient or angry, which was greatly appreciated by his superiors. It seemed to him that he had overcome his fear until the events in his dream. The military had been the radical negation of everything from his past. The parental home in Newfoundland looked like a huge cake. The walls bulged outwards. The roof fell off abruptly. The door behind the overgrown rose garden with a curved iron gate was white with chalk, and looked too bright in contrast to the facade. Around the windows were enameled mosaics in strong colors. The shutters were hanging as if they were about to fall off. On the windowsills stood small statuettes made of terracotta, which had been left there and then had been forgotten. No one ever opened to clean the windows, however, and so the figurines remained in their place, like watchmen gloomily staring at the passers-by. Several oval-shaped balconies with iron railings in a detailed floral pattern adorned the facades. The staircase inside was much too wide and looked as if it was about to collapse at any moment. The plaster was falling off the walls. The surrounding rooms were stuffed with antiques. Richard's father had always heated the house very strongly. Everywhere was the smell of exquisite perfumes and cigars. The rooms were full of art, old furniture and lamps with colorful crystal shades. There was an enormous gilded harp and a statue of a faun chasing a nymph. One of the rooms had an alabaster floor, illuminated from below. Behind heavy velvet curtains were French windows with yellow glass, the color of honey, causing the light to shine in like gold rays. He could still see his father, his face strongly reddened, a considerable belly under the red gold vest, praising a certain wine in the circle of his friends, a connoisseur whose extravagance had brought the family to the brink of financial ruin. His guests, all of them art collectors, were big, loud and cheerful like landowners in former times. His father loved to attend opening celebrations of gourmet restaurants and to talk to the chefs about culinary details. He went to Italy with friends to purchase mosaics for the basement floor. He tried to inspire Richard to start collecting old coins, sent him to a female tailor friend to have him dressed properly, and took him to auctions. Little Richard was terrified at the sight of the overcrowded auction houses, loud and smoky. He took little interest in daily politics. There are so many Arabs, he used to say, and if a bus in India drives into the ditch and 20 Indians die on the spot, who gives a shit? After the funeral, Richard found a portrait head in the attic, covered in thick white cloth. D'Annunzio, sadist and immoralist, preacher of beauty, lust and war. He wondered why his father had not placed it in the living room. Perhaps his mother had objected. She would have had little sympathy for romantic, egomaniac, warmongering poets. Pleasure and beauty were always far less important to her than order and control, and she always wanted to control everything. He could still see her before his inner eye, chasing him down the stairs, dragging an enormous suitcase after her, eyes wide open, words streaming from her mouth, forming a disjointed, only half intelligible shower of exhortations concerning the upcoming school trip. "We shouldn't burn the ship," she used to say, which meant everything had to remain exactly the way it was. The world outside was rough and hostile, and the only thing that provided security was your home. Her attacks of migraine made the house quiet and serious. Richard never had a problem with submission. Mimi was more reluctant, which led to a lot of conflict between her and their mother. Richard was his mother's favorite child, her only confidant, and she always praised him. "Don't take too seriously what your father says, Richard," she said. "He has no idea, or he's simply drunk. And your sister is just a baby. She will grow out of it." Suddenly she was no longer there, and he was left to himself. Now everything she had said and done seemed right and proper. His father had been a loser and a comedian. She had had the necessary severity and sense of order. He wanted to please her in everything. After her death, much more so than ever before, and he never wanted to become like his father. He remained in the attic for a long time, looking at the portrait head. Finally he covered it and took it out to the trash can. Listlessly he flipped through the heavy art books in the library. From time to time he sat down at the piano, played a little Bach or Schubert, but quickly gave it up. It was his mother who had taught him how to play, and he had inherited her long fingers. In the dark it felt easier. Then he played longer pieces, a concert without a listener, for the dead. Most of the time he spent in the armchair under the huge living room window, until long after dark. Every now and then he heard a car passing by outside and saw the glimmer of the headlights on the opposite wall. As a child he had liked to stand there counting the cars in the street. But now the window, like the rest of the house, seemed to him completely absurd. It was very high and arched, like those of a public bath, revealing far too much of the interior to the outside world. Who needed such gigantic window to see the street? At nights he went out, wandering around aimlessly. He liked the empty street, the dark parks, the cool air. Most of the day he spent in a restless half-sleep. One dream he had again and again, in ever-new variations. He had to catch the bus, the train, or a flight. Although he knew it was too late, he kept packing a giant suitcase. But this or that was missing, and he could not find it. In desperation he searched for the missing pieces, faster and faster, in greater and greater panic, until waking up in cold sweat. One night, nearly a year after the accident, he suddenly rose from the armchair, went into his parents' bedroom, opened the large walnut wardrobe, and began pulling his father's silk shirts out and throwing them onto the floor. Finally he stopped, glancing at the chaos while regaining his breath. Then he staggered out of the room, poured himself a cognac from the bar in the corner, and fell into the armchair. His hand that held the glass was trembling. When drinking he felt the same unpleasant feeling coming over him that he had had when finding a book in the library containing old pin-ups from the 50s, Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield, objects of the fantasies of boys of a past generation. The next day he felt restless. He walked through the silent rooms, but was unable to stay anywhere. At last the feeling became unbearable. He called a real estate agent and an auction house, sold the house and the antiques, moved into a small furnished flat in Schwabing. A hard bed, a small table, a chair, a bookcase, all made of natural wood, and enrolled for a study of marine engineering at the Technical University. His father had been a great lover of wine, but he had been unable to appreciate beer. Consequently, Richard drank beer. He went to the illegal beer drinking contests held in the cellar of an old house, where students drank until falling unconscious, and cheered at the competitors like the others did. In his spare time he attended lectures in mathematics and in philosophy. Math and philosophy, that meant discipline in learning and freedom of thought, the accuracy of the scientist and the creativity of the artist, knowledge and wisdom. However, it quickly became clear to him that most of what was taught at the university consisted of dead knowledge, without relevance to one's own life, thought splinters without connection and with no depth, inhibiting creative thinking rather than stimulating it. Mathematics was regarded as poetry by the professors, its ultimate aim being the beauty of the formula, and contemporary philosophy had degenerated into an intellectual play with words. One Sunday, after a night of heavy drinking, he was awakened by the bells of the small church on the opposite side of the street. From the tone they seemed to be hanging right over his bed. The sound penetrated his stomach, chest and limbs, reaching all the way out into his teeth, fingers and toes. His whole body was vibrating. Everything disgusted him. The asceticism in science, the student life, and himself most of all. He stopped attending the philosophical and mathematical lectures, as well as frequenting the student pubs, registered at the most expensive gym he could find in Munich, so as not to meet with any colleagues from his courses, and took up daily physical exercise and a hard diet. Once when he wanted to use the leg curling machine, it was already occupied. On the bench lay a young blonde flat on her stomach, pulling her lower legs up, thereby raising her little bottom an inch. A groan escaped her. He stood there staring at her until she sat up. She saw him and laughed. "Have you never seen a woman before?" She got up and took her towel. "Thank you," he murmured, leaning towards the machine, adjusting the weight. When he rose, she was still there. She looked at him searchingly. "What's your name?" "Richard." "Paula." He nodded and lay down. "Are you a student?" she asked. "There are not many young people here." "That's why I choose this one." "And why is that?" He didn't know what to answer. She started typing on her smartphone. "Give me your number, Richard, and we'll talk later," she said. It was pleasant to hear his name, as if they had known each other for a long time. He gave her the number. "I'll call you." A smile, and she was gone. Was she planning to complain about sexual harassment? Now she would be able to find his family name. He might as well have given her his membership number. Would the management terminate his membership? When the phone finally rang the following evening, he flinched, but it wasn't the studio, it was the girl. She took him to good restaurants, to classy parties, and finally to her parents. After she graduated in business management, she married him. Paula was already on her way to the top, and she needed his support for her future plans. She had judged him correctly, but not herself. This was the section called The Silent House, the second intermediate chapter from the book White Lights, a novel on the crisis of modern day men. I hope you enjoy this. Feel free to leave your comments below, give me a thumbs up, and of course to subscribe to this channel. And next time I hope to read the second chapter to you, which is called Prometheus.